You may imagine castles and cobbled streets, valiant knights on horseback and ladies in long velvet gowns, candle-lit feasts and simple rustic life, but this romanticized image of medieval times barely scratches the festering surface of what was in truth a brutal, punishing, and unforgiving age that would break most modern people before the day's end. For from the moment you opened your eyes within the walls of a thatched peasant hut or a draughty stone keep, the first thing to assault you would be the air itself, rancid with the smell of unwashed bodies, chamber pots brimming in corners, burning dung fires, rot from food stores, and the closeness of livestock that often lived under the same roof as their owners. And if you managed not to gag, you would soon be hit by the raw discomfort of the straw mattress beneath you, often crawling with fleas and lice, the coarseness of a woolen tunic that had never known soap, and the cold, always the cold, for there was no insulation, no central heating, just a hearth that smoked more than it warmed and thin wool cloaks that barely kept the chill from your bones. And as you stumbled out into the dim grey morning, where dawn brought no relief but only a prompt to labour, you would face an endless list of physically brutal chores, fetching water from a distant well or stream, hacking at frozen ground or shoveling mud, tending to animals, mucking stalls, repairing fences, spinning wool, threshing grain with aching shoulders, or, for women and children, grinding flour by hand with heavy stones, a task that took hours each day just to produce a little bread. And while you bent to your work, your hands would blister and crack, your back would ache, and your stomach would growl, for food was neither plentiful nor varied. It was dull, often rancid, and mostly plant-based, unless you lived near a lord's estate, where you might be allowed scraps from the hunt, or bits of salted pork or fish on holy days. But even then, everything would be coarse, unrefined, cooked in soot-blackened pots over open fires that gave everything a burnt or earthy taste, and your teeth, unused to hard barley bread or grist-filled porridge, would begin to suffer, especially since dental hygiene consisted of wiping your mouth with a cloth and perhaps chewing herbs if you were lucky, and by midday, if you'd made it that far, your hands might be covered in grime, your face smeared with sweat, and your body sweltering beneath layers of scratchy clothing. And let's say you scraped yourself on a nail, or got a blister that burst, or inhaled too much ash. These small injuries could quickly fester, become infected, and without antibiotics or even a clean cloth, you'd be at the mercy of your immune system and whatever healing herbs the local wise woman could find, often guided by superstition and trial and error more than actual knowledge. And if you thought perhaps you could find safety or rest inside a castle, think again, for most castles were damp, dark, and foul-smelling, the rushes on the floors filled with years of rotting food and urine, the draughty stone walls dripping with moisture, and disease spreading quickly through the servants and soldiers crammed inside. And don't even think about the bathroom, because there wasn't one, only garderobes built over chutes that funneled waste into cesspits or moats, breeding grounds for dysentery, typhoid, and worse. And let's suppose you tried to travel, riding a horse you don't know how to saddle, with no paved roads, only muddy tracks, rutted and often impassable, where thieves waited in forests and no one rode alone without risk. Your modern instincts would betray you at every turn, as you'd drink water straight from a stream, not knowing it was contaminated by the tanner upstream who dumped lime and urine into it, or you'd speak to the wrong person in the wrong tone, not realizing the complex hierarchy of deference and obedience that governed every interaction, where a wrong word to a noble could mean a whipping or worse. And if you happened to be mistaken for a foreigner, heretic, or spy, you might find yourself in the hands of men who believed deeply in torture as both punishment and truth-finding, and their tools were not crude by accident, but by design. thumbscrews, racks, branding irons, the pillory, the flaying knife, the Iron Maiden, if you were unlucky, or simply the rope and stake. And justice was not blind, it was brutal and public, designed to instill fear more than fairness. And for women, life was even less forgiving, with the constant threat of death in childbirth, the assumption of inferiority, and the ever-present danger of accusations of witchcraft, especially if you dared to own a cat, heal a child, or know too much about herbs or the stars. And for children, the idea of a carefree youth was non-existent. Many were put to work at the age of 6 or 7, hauling water, weaving, learning a trade through beatings and hard repetition, while others were given to the church or to noble houses as servants. And even the privileged classes suffered, for though they ate more and wore finer clothes, they were constantly exposed to political intrigue, forced marriages, wars, and the looming threat of plague, which paid no heed to rank, sweeping through cities and countryside alike in waves of black death, turning bodies into pustule-ridden corpses within days. And there was no treatment, only prayer, and if you tried to flee, you'd often be barred from entering other towns or villages, which closed their gates and lit fires to ward off the infected. And let's not forget the omnipresence of religion, which dictated every waking moment, from when to rise, how to pray, what to eat, what to wear, who to marry, when to confess, how to die. And if you questioned doctrine or acted outside the church's will, you could be excommunicated, shunned, or even burned. And though the clergy offered some literacy and learning, most people never read a word in their lives, for books were handwritten, chained to altars, and written in Latin, inaccessible to the commoner, whose understanding of the world was shaped by folklore, sermon, and hearsay. And while modern people are accustomed to choice, freedom of movement, leisure and privacy, in medieval times these were non-existent luxuries. You ate what you were given, worked where you were born, married whom your parents arranged, and rarely ventured farther than a few miles from your home. And if you did, you could not expect mercy or familiarity beyond your parish, for the world was divided, not by nations, but by feudal loyalties, where allegiances were bought in blood and land, and you owed your life to your lord, who owed his life to the king, who might be a tyrant or a boy. And war could erupt without notice, bringing sword, fire, and famine to your village. And even if you were untouched by war, the rhythms of the year were dictated by harsh seasons, bitter winters, where livestock froze and food stores dwindled, muddy springs that brought floods and rot, hot summers where flies swarmed and water dried up, and harvests that, if they failed, spelled starvation. And unlike today, there were no safety nets, no relief, no government assistance. When food ran out, you died or stole, and then died for stealing. And all the while, death loomed large, ever-present and familiar, with cemeteries overflowing and burial shrouds, reused, and mourning a constant part of life, so common that children played in graveyards, and songs about death were sung at weddings. And even in cities like London or Paris, life was no safer, with overcrowded slums, rivers choked with sewage, pigs wandering through markets, and fires a constant hazard thanks to open flames and wooden structures packed together like kindling. And if you caught a fever, or a tooth rotted, or your appendix burst, you would face either death or the surgeon Barber with his blood-stained apron and his bucket of leeches. And even for those who managed to live long enough to reach their 30s or 40s, the body was wrecked with toil, hunched, scarred, and twisted, often blind, deaf, or limping. And perhaps the cruelest blow was that you would never know anything else. You would never dream of another life, never hope for travel, or comfort, or art, unless you were one of the rare few born into nobility. And even then, the sword of politics, betrayal, toil and early death hung just as heavily, and so if you, a modern person accustomed to soap and medicine, rights and laws, choice and comfort, were somehow dropped into the year 1250, your body would falter, your senses revolt, your speech betray you, your habits mark you as alien, your health collapse under the weight of malnutrition, exposure, bacteria, parasites, superstition, and toil, and your mind, conditioned by modern knowledge, freedom, and expectation, would find itself trapped in a reality where the light was dim, the air rank, the pain constant, and the future short and brutish, and if by some miracle you made it to sundown, perhaps collapsed in a corner of a hut beside the fire, gnawing a dry crust with shaking hands, listening to the howls of wolves, or the moans of the sick, you might begin to understand not just why you wouldn't last a day in medieval times, but why those who did were forged in pain and poverty, and how the human spirit, starved, beaten, and humbled, endured by sheer will alone. And should you survive that first punishing day, you would awaken not refreshed, but more fatigued than ever, your limbs stiff from cold and labor, your eyes rimmed with grit, and your skin itchy from lice that nestled in your bedding and clothing, and with no way to properly bathe, no hot showers, no soap with antibacterial agents, no towels or privacy, you'd splash your face with freezing, probably contaminated water, and begin again, because idleness was not tolerated, and time was not your own, as every man, woman, and child was bound by the ticking demands of daylight and seasons, measured not in minutes but in tolling bells, rising suns, and laboring hands, and you might think to find solace in religion or art, but you'd quickly realize that the church was not a place of comfort so much as a gatekeeper of fear and obedience, its sermons steeped in Latin and its priests not always moral exemplars, but often extensions of noble families, holding land and power, and ready to punish sin with public humiliation, penance, or in worst cases, burning and excommunication. And if you thought yourself modern and educated, speaking of evolution or heliocentric theories, you'd soon be branded a blasphemer or madman, your words seen as dangerous poison to the established order, and whispering new ideas could bring the Inquisition, not enlightenment, and even expressing grief in a manner too bold or loud could draw suspicion, for the medieval mind was one shaped by fear of the unseen, of demons, spirits, fairies, curses, and the all-consuming wrath of God. And the people who endured this life did not do so lightly, but because they had never known any other, because they were trained from birth to bend under hardship, to survive in silence, and to accept that disease, famine, and fire were not failures of infrastructure or science, but divine punishment, or the turning of the celestial wheel. And it's easy now to imagine stepping into their shoes, wearing a cloak, eating by firelight, riding a horse through a forest path. But the moment you coughed blood, or were bitten by a rat, or stepped on a rusty nail, the illusion would shatter, and your body, deprived of vaccines, antibiotics, clean water, sanitation, and the 100 small protections of modern life, would begin its rapid decline, and no one would be able to save you because no one could, and even if someone tried, their tools would be crude, their knowledge half-shaped by folklore, their medicine more poison than cure, and you might be bled by leeches or purged with wormwood or fed mercury if they thought your humours imbalanced, and if you screamed from the pain, you'd be told it was sin leaving your body or the devil being driven out, and your screams would be common music in a world where childbirth often ended in death, where old age meant reaching your 40s, where your bones might break from simple slips and never heal right again, and for all the noise of modern people about mental health and rest and wellness, in medieval times, despair was a private cross to bear, spoken of in murmurs to a priest, or prayed away by candlelight, because no one could afford to sit in sorrow when mouths needed feeding, fields needed tending, and death always loomed nearby, and you'd see children with bent spines and missing teeth, men with half limbs, women hunched and hollow-eyed from one too many births, and no one pitied them. They worked until they dropped, and their places were quickly filled because survival required community, and community required hard limits. And if you could not work, you were not useful, and if you were not useful, you were either a burden or a threat. And while there were moments of joy, festival days, music played on crude instruments, dancing beneath moonlight, harvest celebrations with bread and mead, they were brief, hard-earned and often tinged with loss. And if you looked to the cities for culture or advancement, you would find pestilence, human waste tossed into alleys, rats scuttling over feet, food sold in filthy conditions, fires that destroyed entire districts overnight, and the sound of screaming from plague houses nailed shut with infected families inside, left to die behind boarded windows. And if you could read, you might find a rare book in a monastery, guarded by monks who copied texts by hand, and even those books might be full of mysticism, alchemical illusions, or theories based on Aristotle and Galen, flawed yet clung to as gospel. And universities, where they existed, taught theology and rhetoric, not science or medicine as we know it. And even there, women were forbidden, peasants excluded, and knowledge doled out as a tool of control, and the world outside Europe fared no better for survival. Whether in the sultanates of the Middle East, the empires of Africa, or the dynasties of Asia, life was still ruled by hierarchy, hardship, and the violence of man against man or nature against man. And while some cultures advanced faster in astronomy or architecture, none had the comforts you take for granted. No refrigeration, no sterile tools, no germ theory, no anesthetic, no sanitation systems, no eyeglasses that worked well, no hearing aids, no shoes with arch support, no meaningful legal recourse if someone harmed you and they outranked you. And if you were a woman, the odds were stacked even higher, for most lived and died beneath the thumb of father, husband, or church. Their lives defined by reproduction and labor, their voices rarely recorded unless they were saints or heretics. And even nuns, those rare educated few, lived in cloisters of silence, and often chose the veil not from piety, but because it was the only escape from marriage or poverty. And if you were LGBTQ+, your very existence would be outlawed and punished severely. And if you were disabled, you might be seen as cursed, possessed, or unworthy of life, and society offered neither understanding nor aid. And if you had dark skin in a predominantly white European town, you would be either exoticized, enslaved, or feared. And if you had a stammer, a limp, a mole in the wrong place, or were too clever by half, you risked being branded a witch or devil's servant, and the punishment was never merciful. And if you fled into the forest, hoping for solitude or survival, you'd face wolves, bandits, starvation, exposure, and the growing madness of isolation. And even if you joined a monastic order, trading the world for silence, prayer, and work, you would still suffer the grind of fasting, freezing stone cells, punishing schedules, and constant fear of damnation, because every thunderstorm was a divine warning, every crop failure a curse, every eclipse a portent of doom. And even the educated believed in omens, relics, saints who bled or wept, and the efficacy of touching bones or drinking holy water to ward off illness. And while great cathedrals rose in wonder, they were built with blood, thousands of labourers who died beneath falling stones, from lung disease from dust, from infections after crushing injuries, their names lost while the names of bishops and kings were carved in marble. And if you thought your strength of will could see you through, your body would say otherwise, because even the strongest broke under this world's demands, and the few who thrived did so by privilege or violence or cunning, and even they died young, often poisoned, betrayed, or wasted by disease. And this was a world where most people never saw their their own reflection clearly, never heard music beyond what could be sung or plucked on strings, never travelled more than a few miles, never tasted sugar or chocolate or coffee, never owned a mirror, a map, or a proper knife, never knew what caused the common cold or why women bled each month, never questioned the order of things because the order was the only thing keeping the world from chaos, and you, who know of atoms and stars, of democracy and rights, who have stood in antiseptic rooms and walked on paved streets, who expect clean water, hot food, safety and respect, would find this world to be a horror of grit and suffering, and even if you were placed into the highest castle, dressed in velvet and served by a dozen maids, you'd feel the cold, the draught, the weight of isolation, the threat of war, and the ever-pressing fear of illness, and your stomach would rebel against the greasy, overspiced food, your skin would crawl with filth, your lungs would ache from soot, and your heart would long for music, silence, ease, or kindness. And you would soon see that even the lords lived in gilded cages, beholden to kings and papal edicts, fighting wars they didn't start, marrying for power not love, fearing rebellion from below, and vengeance from above, and each passing hour would wear away your illusions, your strength, and your spirit, until you were either broken into acceptance like the rest, or perished by exposure, infection, violence, or grief. And so when people today speak longingly of a simpler time, of a golden age, when men were men and life was clean and pure, they forget that this simplicity was a euphemism for suffering, and purity was born not of health or virtue but of absence. Absence of knowledge, of comfort, of choice, of safety, and that the gleaming myths of chivalry and nobility obscure the rivers of blood, the forests of gallows, the plague carts, the starving orphans, the fields salted in war, and the millions who lived and died without ever being remembered. And it is not weakness but wisdom to understand that you, born of comfort, science, freedom, and peace, would not last a day in their world, not because you lack strength, but because they were forged by fire you have never felt, and they endured a darkness you've never seen. And though your body might break, it is your mind, your spirit, your sense of self and fairness and identity that would fracture first under the weight of a world where none of that mattered, and you would long for the click of a switch, the whisper of a warm vent, the softness of a bed, the clean taste of filtered water, the steady hum of refrigeration, the warm glow of electric light, and you would learn, painfully and profoundly, that the past was not a fantasy, it was a crucible, and only those born to it could hope to survive it, and you, unbaptized in its relentless fire, would last not even a single, merciless medieval day, and if by some miracle you managed to survive not only one day, but several, clinging to some crude sense of purpose, perhaps by falling into a routine among the peasantry, or seeking refuge within the walls of a monastery, or the kitchen of a noble house, you would begin to realize that even the very concept of time was alien in this age, not something measured in hours and minutes, but governed by the position of the sun, the tolling of church bells, and the turning of the seasons, and without clocks, calendars, or written reminders. Everything depended on memory and repetition, a life lived by rote, season after season, generation after generation, and soon the days would blur together in a haze of toil and necessity, with few moments to pause, fewer still to reflect, and none at all to express dissatisfaction or dream of a different future. For dreams in medieval times were not aspirations, but portents, often believed to carry divine or demonic significance, and to speak too freely of them could draw suspicion or fear, and as your modern mind strained against this enforced simplicity, you would find that even language was an obstacle, for though you might have assumed that you could speak English to get by, you would quickly discover that the tongue of Chaucer or William the Conqueror was as foreign to your ears as Latin or Old Norse. With its thick, guttural pronunciations and wildly different vocabulary, and even regional dialects could vary so widely that a man from Kent might not understand a man from York, and so you'd be forced to communicate through gesture, deference and mimicry, which could easily lead to misunderstandings, and misunderstanding in a society rigidly ordered by class, feudal loyalty, gender roles, and spiritual authority was dangerous, and if you failed to bow low enough to a reeve or gave the wrong answer to a question posed by a village priest, you might be whipped, locked in the stocks, or driven out of the parish entirely, and though you might think to defend yourself, to argue or reason or present your logic, you would soon find that logic carried little weight here unless it aligned with doctrine or tradition, and even the simplest debate could be seen as insubordination or heresy, and should you show signs of literacy or strange knowledge, you might draw the gaze of the authorities who distrusted anything beyond the canon of scripture and the writings of a few accepted scholars, and women who spoke with too much confidence, too much fluency, or with too many questions were especially at risk, for it was commonly believed that women were weaker in reason and more easily led by Satan, and a clever woman, especially one with knowledge of healing or astrology, could find herself accused of witchcraft simply for being out of place or poorly understood, and the punishment was not mild, ranging from being bound and ducked in a river to see if she floated, thereby proving guilt, or being subjected to invasive, humiliating examinations for witches' marks, or worst of all, being burned at the stake in a spectacle meant as much to entertain as to deter, and this punishment was often administered not in secret but as public theatre, drawing crowds who jeered and prayed in equal measure, as though bearing witness were a civic duty and not a moral stain, and as the fire roared or the noose tightened, people clutched their rosaries and thanked God it was not them, for fear kept communities in line more effectively than chains ever could, and it was this constant awareness of one's place and the price of stepping outside it that shaped every decision and action, from how you dressed to how you addressed others, and there were sumptuary laws that dictated what colours and fabrics you could wear based on your station, so even if you had access to a lord's discarded cloak or a merchant's fine belt, wearing them without title could result in fines or worse, for clothing was not just fashion, it was rank, and any disruption of this visible order was a threat to the hierarchy itself, and should you attempt to hide your modern identity by blending in, you would soon be undone by your posture, your reluctance to kneel, your surprise at everyday miseries, your distaste for animal cruelty or public punishment, or your hesitation when called to perform tasks that required brutal efficiency, such as killing livestock, chopping wood for hours, or butchering game, and the tools of labour were not ergonomic or safe, but heavy, crude and dangerous, and accidents were common, with lost fingers, shattered feet, and head injuries suffered in silence, or with primitive remedies that often did more harm than good, and as you limped or winced through the day, you would be expected to continue, for no one rested unless commanded, and no one recovered unless their body could do so without aid, and in the background, life went on. Babies were born in smoke-filled huts with only rags and herbs, often dying within days, and if they lived, their chances of reaching adulthood were no better than even odds, and women bore child after child until their bodies gave out, their deaths marked by short prayers and a return to the fields, for the living could not afford to mourn for long, and men were conscripted into war or levied for building projects, forced to leave their homes and march under banners they barely understood, fighting for kings who had never seen them and causes that meant nothing to them, and in war there was no glory, only slaughter, starvation and disease, and while knights rode with lances and polished armour, the common foot soldiers fought with cudgels, axes and fear, and many were cut down in seconds or trampled by horses, their names unrecorded, and their bodies left to rot or burn, and if you found yourself caught between armies, enemies, as many villages did, you would not be spared for your neutrality, for soldiers lived off the land and its people, stealing food, burning homes and taking what they wished, including daughters and livestock, and if you resisted you were killed, and if you submitted you were still ruined, and so survival often meant submission, endurance and silence, virtues praised in sermons and demanded by life itself, and if you sought comfort in food, you would find it lacking, not only in variety but in quality, for bread was coarse and dark, laced with grit from millstones and full of bugs, and meat was rare and often spoiled, covered in heavy spices to mask its rot, and dairy turned quickly in the heat, and had to be consumed fast, or fermented into hard cheese, and even then, illness from food was common, with no understanding of bacteria or preservation, and water, while plentiful in rivers and wells, was often tainted by runoff, waste or decay, leading many to drink weak ale or mead, which though low in alcohol, added to the haze and fatigue of daily life, and the smell of the world was ever present, a stew of sweat, waste, smoke, blood, mold and animals, that no one could truly escape, and soon your senses would dull from constant exposure, but your soul would ache with the sheer monotony and smallness of life. For ambition was dangerous, curiosity discouraged, and travel nearly impossible, unless you were part of a merchant caravan, a pilgrim, or a soldier, and even then, each night brought the risk of wolves, bandits, storms, and strange towns where you were unwelcome, and inns were rare and filthy, and sleeping on the floor of a church was often your best option, but only if the priest allowed it, and in the growing chill of winter, your breath visible in the air, and your toes numb inside your boots, you would feel the slow crawl of death through your bones, not sudden and violent, but creeping, in the form of chilblains, of frostbite, of fevers caught from too many cold nights and too little food, and the church would offer prayers and perhaps hot broth, but no healing, no miracle, and as you lay wrapped in furs that stank of smoke and sweat, your body aching and your stomach cramping, you would begin to long, not for warmth, but for the memory of warmth, the idea of a world where pain was not constant, where life did not depend on fealty, obedience, and fate, and that longing would be a curse, because those around you would not understand it, would see your sadness as weakness, your strangeness as threat, and though you might cling to kindness, might offer a smile or a helpful hand, trust was rare, earned only over years, and through shared hardship, and strangers were rarely welcomed without suspicion, and if you tried to explain yourself, to confess the truth of where you came from, your words would be seen as madness, as lies, as heresy, and at best you'd be ignored, at worst imprisoned, tortured, or executed, for the simple act of being what they could not understand, and you would see then, with painful clarity, that surviving this world was not about intelligence or adaptation, but about being born within it, moulded by its cruelty, and grounded in its certainties, and you were not, and so even if your heart endured, your body would fail, or if your body endured, your mind would break, and either way, the day would come, sooner than you think, when your name was spoken in past tense, when your strange habits were whispered about, when your corpse was laid on a plank and buried with little ceremony in unconsecrated ground, and you would be forgotten, your story erased by time, for in medieval life, memory belonged to the church, the nobility, and the stone inscriptions carved for the rare few who could afford remembrance, and you, a wanderer from another time, would vanish like smoke in a world where no one had time to look up, and the wheel would turn, and another harsh dawn would rise. And as the seasons turned and your place in this grim tapestry of life became more defined, you would find the steady erosion of identity not as a sudden collapse, but as a slow surrender, for the longer you stayed, the more you would be forced to abandon your sense of self, your sense of fairness, your understanding of dignity, and even your instincts for resistance, for the medieval world had a way of bending its inhabitants into shapes that matched its needs, not their desires, and to survive here was not to thrive, but to disappear into routine, to learn silence as safety and hardship as habit, and while you might once have expected moments of peace or stillness, you would soon find that even rest was a form of labor, for sleep was broken by the howls of wolves, the groans of the dying, the whispering winds that slipped through cracks in stone and timber, and by the nightly rituals of checking for rats in your bedding or embers in the hearth that could ignite your entire dwelling, and dreams were not a refuge, but a mirror of fears, demons, starvation, fire, and grief. And should you wake in the middle of the night, cold and disoriented, there would be no comfort, no light switch, no warm drink, only the knowledge that dawn was still hours away, and the next day's demands would be no lighter, and if you lived among peasants, your body would grow numb to the repetition of agricultural labor, digging, weeding, scything, threshing, planting, tending animals, and every year would follow a predictable pattern shaped not by your choices, but by the whims of weather and the demands of landowners or the church, who extracted taxes and tithes with the unrelenting efficiency of a parasite that devoured without ever breaking the host. And if the harvest failed, whether due to blight or drought or infestation or an early frost, the consequences were swift and terrible. Children crying themselves to sleep with hunger, entire families boiling grass or bark for soup, mothers selling their daughters into servitude, and men wandering from village to village in search of work, only to be branded vagrants and whipped or imprisoned. And famine didn't just kill the body, it crushed the soul, pitting neighbour against neighbour, eroding the fragile bonds of kinship until people became scavengers, more beast than man, and in some of the darkest winters there were whispers of cannibalism, of graves dug up and boiled bones picked clean, and though the records rarely say it aloud, the pain of those years lingers like a shadow behind every medieval tale of sorrow and survival, and if plague came, as it so often did, it arrived like a judgment, swift, merciless, and beyond reason, with buboes swelling beneath arms and groins, blackened limbs, bleeding gums, and corpses piling in the streets, so many that carts could not keep up, and burial became a mass affair, with priests reading last rites from a distance, if at all, and the living so terrified that they abandoned even their own kin, locking doors against the sick, and fleeing to hills or forests where they perished alone. And for those who survived the waves of death, there was no celebration, only a quieter world, one missing half its voices, with fields untended, homes abandoned, and the air itself seeming heavier with memory and grief. And for the survivors, suspicion grew. Why did some live while others died? Who had brought this curse upon them? Fingers were pointed at Jews, lepers, witches, foreigners, and beggars, and entire communities were burned, drowned, hanged, or exiled, not because there was evidence, but because terror seeks scapegoats like fire seeks fuel, and in this crucible of pain and ignorance, you would find that mercy was rare and often punished, that knowledge was feared, and that your very instincts to question, to suggest, to offer alternatives would be seen as dangerous, because in a world where survival depends on conformity and obedience, deviation is seen not as innovation but as threat, and so you would begin to shrink, to walk with your head down, to speak less, to mimic the rhythms of those around you, until you too began to forget the feel of your former life, and the voice in your head that once shouted in protest now only whispered in warning, telling you to wait, to endure, to stay silent, and if by chance you managed to enter the church, perhaps cloistered as a monk or nun in some cold stone abbey, you would trade physical hardship for spiritual, for though you might escape the lash of the field and the hunger of the poor, you would now endure endless hours of prayer, fasting, silence, and penance, your body bound to bells that rang in the night, and your mind filled with endless Passages of scripture and hymn, repeated until you no longer questioned their meaning, but simply recited them like incantations to keep the darkness at bay. And though monasteries housed knowledge, they were not sanctuaries of reason but fortresses of dogma, where books were copied not to be read but to be preserved, and the curious mind could easily be accused of pride or heresy, and the only escape from such a life was death, which was spoken of not with fear but with resignation, for death was the only certainty in a world of chaos, and funerals were common, not as unique celebrations of a life, but as ritual acknowledgements that another soul had passed into judgment, and you would attend many before your own, watching bodies wrapped in shrouds, lowered into earth with the same muttered prayers, their names already half forgotten by the time the soil was tamped down, and if you were lucky, someone might mark your grave with a stone, but most would rot anonymously beneath fields that would one day be ploughed, and while the church taught that heaven awaited the righteous, few truly believed in comfort beyond the veil, only in relief from pain, and that hope was enough to keep them obedient, and if you thought you might find meaning in art or music, you would be limited to what was permitted, icons, frescoes, chants, all devoted to God, and any attempt at personal expression, any story that deviated from holy writ or moral allegory, would be suppressed, for the individual soul mattered only as part of the flock, and not as a source of uniqueness or creativity, and so even beauty was functional, designed to inspire piety or fear, not joy, and even in the great cathedrals with their soaring vaults and stained glass, there was a kind of sublimity that overwhelmed rather than uplifted, making the believer feel small, fragile and dependent, and should you witness the workings of law and justice, you would be dismayed to learn that it was not designed to protect, but to preserve order, with trials that were often decided by birth, bribes or spectacle, and punishment that ranged from fines and lashings to mutilation or execution, and prisons were not centres of reform but holes where the accused rotted, often chained to walls in pitch darkness, their screams ignored by guards who had heard it all before, and public punishments were intended not to heal but to warn, with stocks, floggings, brandings, and hangings held in market squares, attended by families who treated them as communal entertainment, bringing children and food to watch the condemned struggle and weep, and as you watched sickened, you would understand that in this world, empathy was a luxury few could afford, and even compassion had limits, for the well-being of one often came at the expense of others, and scarcity bred selfishness more often than solidarity, and so you would learn to harden, to care in secret, to offer kindness in ways that would not be seen or punished, and even those gestures would come with risk, and the deeper you fell into this world, the more you would lose, first your sense of time, then your sense of fairness, then your sense of identity, until at last you became a husk shaped by fear, hunger and habit, and you might survive for months, even years, but you would not be living, you would be enduring, and though there were moments of light, a child's laugh, a shared crust of warm bread, the hush of snowfall, the glow of candlelight on a loved one's face, these moments were fleeting, islands of warmth in a sea of struggle, and they passed too quickly, always chased by the next demand, the next danger, the next sorrow, and if one day you found yourself standing on a hillside at sunset, watching the red light touch the ruins of a burned-out village, the cries of orphans in the distance, the tolling of a church bell for yet another dead farmer, you would realize with aching clarity that this world was not a place you could visit, it was a trial you could not escape, and every breath you took in it was borrowed, every kindness a risk, every day survived a victory against odds stacked high and merciless, and as you looked at your coal-used hands, your sunburned face, your hollowed eyes, you would understand that the people who lived here were not primitive, they were titans, forged by a world that demanded everything and gave little, and though they died young, they carried the world forward inch by painful inch. And it is not that you as a modern person are weak, but that you were never meant to bear such weight, and your soul, though vast, has never had to bend so low, or rise so high, just to find a scrap of peace. And so the truth settles on you like the cold. You would not last a day in medieval times, not for lack of strength, but because you were born of light, and this world was made of shadow. And if after all this time, if after the breaking of your body and the silencing of your voice and the grinding of your will into the soil of that ancient world, you still stood, if somehow you endured the filth and famine, the ritualized cruelty and the cold that seeped into your marrow, if somehow you found a rhythm to it all, a way to fetch water without bruising your shoulders, or to till the earth without splitting your palms, if somehow you had learnt to suppress your reflexes, to bow when needed and hold your tongue when necessary, if you had managed to vanish into the crowd of the indistinct, to survive by becoming no one special, then perhaps you would find that the greatest wound of all was not one dealt to your flesh, but to your memory. For soon even your own sense of self would begin to erode, and the vivid, clean, humming world you had once known, of electric lights, of glass and steel, of language spoken freely and knowledge at your fingertips, would seem to you like some fevered dream, half remembered in moments when the wind quieted, or when you stared too long at your reflection in a muddy puddle and wondered who exactly was looking back. And in those moments, when the noise and the stench and the unceasing demands of survival abated just enough to give your mind space to wander, you would find yourself struggling to recall the sound of a car engine, the hum of a refrigerator, the texture of a hot shower on your skin, the scent of shampoo or fresh soap, the softness of cotton bed sheets, the whir of a fan, or the crispness of a printed page, and you would begin to doubt whether those things had ever been real at all, or whether they had only ever lived in the folds of some imagined heaven, because what you knew now, the daily ache in your spine, the constant chafing of wool and leather, the dark under your fingernails that never went away, the taste of grit in your bread, and the sting of ash in your throat, that was what was real now, and everything else was a tale you told yourself in the quiet moments to stave off madness. And you would not be alone in your forgetting, for the people around you would also live in a kind of unending now, where yesterday was not history but simply another day of labour, and tomorrow was a repetition of today, unless the world took a turn for the worse, as it so often did with sudden illness, or unexpected war, or a new tax levied by a noble who had lost favour with his lord, and now sought to squeeze his tenants dry, to buy forgiveness. And every time a new hardship came, you would feel some final piece of you fall away, and yet you would go on, because everyone did, because the body does not need hope to move, only hunger and fear and the pull of duty and repetition. And perhaps that was the most terrifying lesson of all, that you could live without joy, without meaning, without even a name, if enough days passed like this, and in the long stretches between disasters, there would be nothing to mark the passage of time, except the changing of crops, and the growing of children, and the slow crumbling of your teeth, which would ache at night, and loosen over the years until you could chew no more, and still you would work, gumming coarse bread, and sipping thin broth, and wincing with every bite, because to rest was to die, and no one could afford that luxury, and if you took ill, as you inevitably would, you would lie on a straw pallet, while your friends or family gathered around, not with hope, but with resignation, perhaps lighting a candle, or whispering a prayer, maybe applying a poultice of moss, or onion or vinegar, none of which would help, but all of which gave the appearance of doing something, and your fever would climb, and your bowels would loosen, and your breath would come in rattling gasps, and as your vision swam, and your muscles cramped, you would think not of your first day in this world, but of your last in the other one, and how long ago that seemed now. now, and how strange that once you thought in terms of convenience and leisure and safety, and now those words were as distant and fantastical as the stories told by the old men who claimed to have seen dragons or saints walk among them, and if by some miracle you recovered, thin and weakened but alive, you would feel less relief than shame, because your illness had burdened others, and your recovery meant you had to repay that debt, and so you would be sent back to the field or the hearth before your strength returned, dragging your bones through days that no longer had names, only work, and the world would press down harder, as if testing the limit of your endurance, and you would find that even joy came with a cost. For a wedding meant debts to the priest and the lord, a birth meant another mouth to feed and another soul to worry over, a festival meant a full day of labour preparing food and drink that would be gone in hours, and even love, rare and dangerous as it was, had to be hidden or sanctioned by the church. And passion outside of marriage was punished severely, especially for women, and should a child be born outside of wedlock, the shame could mark not only the mother but the child for life, and the father might be whipped or exiled, or, if a man of means, quietly excused, and if you lived in a town or city, these rules were even more complex and enforced by guilds and councils, and the noise and filth were constant, with narrow streets filled with shouting vendors, and the clash of hooves and wheels, and human waste tossed from windows with only a shouted warning, if any, onto whoever passed below, and even the wealthiest homes were poorly lit and poorly ventilated, with tapestries hung not for beauty but to block draughts, and lice crawling through the furs and silks as easily as through peasant straw, and medicine was still based on the four humours, and you might be bled to balance your temperament, or fed raw garlic and wine to clear your phlegm, and childbirth remained a mortal gamble, even for noble women, with midwives powerless against breech births or hemorrhage, and death so common that mothers often refused to name their children until they survived their first year, and cemeteries became crowded, bones disinterred to make room for new corpses, and skulls stacked in ossuaries that smelled of damp and decay, and plague pits dug deep and covered quick with lime, no markers, no prayers, just earth and silence, and always there was the church, watching, listening, guiding, punishing, consoling, its presence inescapable, its doctrines drilled into every soul, promising eternal life, if only you endured enough suffering now, and yet even priests were not safe, for heresy could be found anywhere, and the Inquisition, when it came not as a thunderclap, but as a whisper first, a question asked at market, a note passed to the bishop, a neighbour's envy dressed as concern, and then one day men in black robes appeared, and someone you knew vanished. And no one spoke of them again except in frightened murmurs, and still the wheel turned, and time passed, and you grew older, though not old, for few reached 60 and fewer still with their faculties intact, and if you did, if you became that grey-bearded relic by the hearth, children might gather around and beg for stories, and perhaps in your broken, half-forgotten memories, you would recall a world of light and speed, a world with machines and comfort and music that flowed from boxes, and you would tell them, and they would laugh, for they would not believe you, and why should they, when nothing in their world resembled your tales, and even you doubted them now, and so you would chuckle along and say you must have dreamed it all, and then one night, quietly, your body would fail you, and you would be found cold in the morning, and wrapped in a blanket and buried in the yard with a priest, murmuring words that no one truly heard, because they had heard them too many times, and life would go on, and you would be forgotten, your face blurred in memory, your name lost in the noise of other births and deaths, and the centuries would pass, and the stone that marked you would weather and fall, and the world you once came came from would rise again in its own cycle, until some future soul looked back and wondered what life was truly like in the Middle Ages, and perhaps imagined it filled with romance and wonder, knights and castles and honor, and perhaps thought they could have endured it, lived nobly in that simpler, purer time, and they too would be wrong, for the truth of that age was not found in the fairy tales, but in the ache of the back, the silence of hunger, the cold that crept in through every wall and into every bone, in the prayers whispered over the dying, the screams in the dark when no help came, the millions who never knew their names would vanish, and in the quiet truth that no modern soul would last a day in medieval times, not for lack of strength, but because strength alone was never enough. And still the story of your struggle in that distant, brutal world would stretch on, because survival in the medieval age was never a triumph, but a surrender, a slow erasure of everything you once were, until you no longer questioned the filth between your toes, the smell that clung to your clothes, or the darkness that fell too quickly each evening and left you blind and vulnerable to the night's cruel breath. In those ceaseless nights, without glass windows or reliable locks, without candles for the poor or warmth in the thatched huts of peasants, you would hear the howls of wolves at the edge of your village, or the rustle of bandits passing on horseback through lonely roads where the only law was the sword. If you were lucky, you might share a bed with others for warmth, crawling beneath rough-spun wool and burlap stuffed with straw that pricked and rustled with each movement, where lice and fleas thrived as persistent companions. There would be no privacy, no moment truly alone. Your life was lived shoulder to shoulder, breath to breath, in close quarters with family, livestock and neighbours, where walls were thin and secrets thinner. The air was thick with smoke and sweat, and the acrid scent of unwashed bodies, and your nose would learn not to flinch because there was no alternative. You would relieve yourself in a bucket or a pit, often shared, and empty its contents into a midden heap or gutter, sometimes beside the very stream from which you fetched your water, water that carried more death than life, teeming with bacteria and waste, a murky broth that no boiling could fully cleanse. You would drink it anyway, because thirst was worse, and your body, like the bodies of everyone around you, would learn to fight and fail, and endure the unclean, the infected, the impure, until infection became as common as the weather, and death was not an event but a season, expected and unwelcome but always nearby. Children died often and quietly. A cough in the night could end a life by morning. Mothers buried infants wrapped in scraps of cloth beneath churchyards that overflowed with the bones of others, marked by nothing but a prayer and perhaps a pebble placed to remember a name quickly fading. Women bore children not in hospitals but on rush-covered floors, attended by midwives who knew the ways of birth from bitter repetition, using tools handed down across generations, trusting in prayer, herbs and the hardened instincts of survival. Sometimes the mother died, sometimes the child, often both, and the women left behind, the grandmothers, the widows, the daughters, wrapped the dead in silence and learned not to weep too loudly, for grief was a luxury and tears a weakness that time did not allow. If a man cried, it was alone in the woods or in the fields, behind the plough, with the sweat disguising the salt on his cheeks. If a woman cried, it was in labour or in confession, kneeling before a priest who could absolve her sins but not her sorrow. And even the church, grand and gilded in the cities, was different in the villages where peasants worshipped in stone chapels built with their own hands, where sermons were delivered in Latin they could not understand, and the stained glass they imagined in holy texts did not exist because glass was precious and rare, a treasure seen only in castles or cathedrals built on the backs of taxes and toil. Your body would grow lean from labour and scarcity. You would eat little and rarely well, black bread from barley or rye, with bits of sand that cracked your teeth, gruel of oats or millet, sometimes mixed with wild greens or nettles on lucky days, a bit of salted fish or pork, so brined and hard it had to be boiled to be chewable. Meat was rare, eggs rarer. You would fast for religious holidays, not out of devotion but out of necessity. Your meals would be shared from a common pot, passed among siblings and elders, and there would be no notion of seconds, only gratitude for the first. In winter, the world narrowed. Food ran low, fires burned out, and illness spread like mist over a frozen land. You would sit beneath your cloak with hands wrapped in rags, watching your breath curl before your face, dreaming of spring, not with joy, but with anxiety, for planting season was not a time of leisure, but of back-breaking haste, and every day lost to frost could mean starvation next winter. You would hoe and dig and sow seeds into earth that had been tilled for centuries, that was tired and overworked, and you would hope for rain but not too much, for sun but not drought, and in truth you hoped for nothing more than another harvest, good enough to keep you going, to keep your children fed, your debts paid, your roof thatched, your tools unbroken. And even if you were not born a serf, if you had the strange misfortune of being born noble or lucky, your life was not your own. If you were a woman, your body belonged to your father until he sold it to a husband, a trade of coin or land that determined your future as clearly as chains. If you were a man, your life was measured by inheritance, by war, by the fragile loyalty of vassals and the whims of distant kings. You would be taught to ride, to hunt, to fight with sword and lance and bow, and you would bleed just as the peasants did, though perhaps with cleaner wounds and better stitching. But the expectations were no lighter. You would die for your name, for your banner, for your lord, and sometimes for no reason at all. You could lose everything: land, title, favour, with a word whispered at court, with an unlucky alliance, with a bad season that bankrupted your estate. And when war came, and it always did, it did not distinguish between peasant and knight. It razed villages, trampled fields, salted earth, violated women, killed indiscriminately. You might fight in it, or be consumed by it, or both, and there would be no triumph, only aftermath. Blackened walls, mass graves, broken stone and broken lives, and the memory of blood where wheat once grew. You would carry wounds that never healed properly, scars that puckered beneath your garments, twisted fingers, crooked spines, rotted teeth. Disease lived in your mouth and gut. You'd die with worms in your belly and ulcers on your legs. You might survive typhus or plague, or the sweating sickness that turned men red and dead in a single day, but probably not all three. And if you lived long enough to grow old, to watch the lines deepen on your weathered hands, you would do so with a body that groaned beneath the weight of a life earned day by day, in the teeth of a world that took more than it ever gave. You would forget what it meant to dream. You would think only of what was needed tomorrow, what was owed, what was due, what was broken and needed fixing. Your pleasures would be small and fleeting: a song at a feast, a smile from a child, a dry night beneath an intact roof. You would learn to laugh even when you bled, because laughter was one of the few rebellions left to the poor and one of the few medicines that cost nothing. And yet, the medieval world did not think of itself as dark or backward. The people who lived in it were not miserable in the way you imagine. They sang songs and told tales. They fell in love. They danced in muddy fields on feast days and carved wooden toys for their children and found beauty in the morning mist over the hills. They believed in miracles and feared the devil, and they watched the stars and measured the heavens and built cathedrals that reached for God even as the earth beneath their feet crumbled. They did not know comfort, but they knew purpose. They did not know freedom, but they knew duty, and in their own way they endured. But you with your modern expectations, your delicate senses, your antiseptic life, and your soft indoor hands, you would not last a day, not because you are weak, but because you are unused to being forgotten by the world, to being crushed by its silence. You have never had to bury a child without a coffin, or trade your last chicken for a leeching, or run barefoot through mud with your tongue swollen from thirst. You have never slept beside a dying man and prayed you would not catch his cough. You have never watched a fire take your home and known no one would help you rebuild it. And so, if you stepped back into that age, into the brutal, grinding heart of the medieval world, you would not be prepared for how fast it would strip you of yourself, how quickly it would make you small, how efficiently it would erase your modern confidence and replace it with hunger, fear, humility, and finally, if you lasted long enough, silence. Because the medieval world was not a place you could visit, not a set for your fantasies, but a relentless, living engine of human struggle. It was a crucible, and only those born of it could truly survive it. And so the days would continue, crawling on beneath low skies and the relentless rhythm of survival, until your modern concept of time and schedule would begin to blur into something more primitive, something dictated not by minutes or appointments, but by the rising and setting of the sun, by the tolling of church bells in the distance, and the needs of the body that knew no rest. You would rise not when you wished, but when the rooster crowed, or when the icy air could no longer be endured beneath the damp wool of your blanket, or when the tasks ahead simply couldn't wait. There was no sleeping in, no weekends, no breaks between the ceaseless demands of toil. There was only obligation to the land, to your lord, to your family, and to the unspoken contract that if you did not work, you would not eat. Your hands, so long accustomed to smooth objects and idle scrolling, would blister and crack from the handle of the hoe, from the coarse rope, from the cold iron of tools that rarely fit well, but must be used anyway. Each finger would become a hardened hook, each joint swollen and sore from effort repeated daily without rest, and your back would begin to bend, not from age but from labor, the stoop of those who plant and reap and carry the burdens of an existence carved from soil and sweat. You would begin to understand why posture was not a luxury of the past, and why people seemed to age not over decades, but in cruel, rapid bursts, as if a single bad harvest could rip 10 years from your bones. The world around you would never feel still. Even when the village lay quiet at night, you'd hear the soft breathing of the others in your shared hovel, the occasional moan of someone troubled by dreams or pain, the scurry of rats, or the distant howl of dogs. And in the day, it was not quiet either. There were no birds chirping sweetly, no idyllic pastoral silence. There was the clang of the blacksmith's hammer, the creak of wagon wheels, the clatter of hooves and hens, the yelling of children, and the lowing of cattle. The murmur of gossip passed in low tones at the well, the occasional scream or cry, and always the bell calling you to prayer, to work, to judgment, or to the burial of yet another soul returned to the earth. That bell could ring 3 times in one morning, and each time it signaled something different, a mass, a punishment, or a funeral. You would learn to read its tones as surely as you once read emails or traffic signals, and you would respond because you had to. If you ignored it, someone would notice, and in the medieval world to be noticed for the wrong reason could mean suspicion, accusation, or punishment. Justice, such as it was, bore little resemblance to what you understand. Trials were rare for the poor, and often symbolic for the rich. Guilt was assumed, innocence nearly impossible to prove, and truth was a matter of status, not evidence. If you were accused of theft, of heresy, of disrespecting your lord or even your neighbor, the punishment could range from humiliation in the stocks to mutilation, flogging, or death. And not a quick death either. Death was often spectacle, meant to teach others. You might be hanged in the square and left to rot, your body picked by crows as a warning to others. You might be boiled, burned, or pressed, depending on the crime and the mood of the authorities. Trial by ordeal was not a myth. Your innocence could be tested by fire or water, by carrying red-hot iron, or by being thrown into a river with your hands bound. If you sank, you were innocent but drowned. If you floated, you were guilty and burned. Justice was not blind, it had a face, and it was cruel, arbitrary, and deeply feared. You would learn quickly to keep your head down, your voice low, your opinions silent. Speaking out about injustice, about cruelty, about unfair taxes, or the mistreatment of women, or the lies of the priest, was a danger you couldn't afford. And the priest was a power you could not ignore. The church was not merely a spiritual guide, but the dominant force in your life, the source of truth, order, calendar, and judgment. You would attend Mass regularly, whether you understood the Latin chants or not, and you would kneel, cross yourself, and take communion, even if your belly growled from hunger. You would fast on holy days, tithe your precious earnings, and pay indulgences if you hoped to reduce your time in purgatory. You would confess your sins, real or imagined, to a man who might be kinder than your Lord or far worse, who might use his authority for good or for unspeakable cruelty. And if you were a woman, your status in the church was mostly silence. You could pray, you could weep, you could scrub the stone floors of the nave, but you could not speak in authority or question a priest. Your virtue was your armor, and your reputation your only shield against ruin. If a rumor took hold that you were a witch, that you knew herbs too well, or had a child out of wedlock, or merely lived alone and angry, you could find yourself chained, accused, tortured, and executed, not because you did magic, but because someone needed a scapegoat, and the church offered the flames. Marriage was not a love story. It was an arrangement, often decided by parents or lords, designed to merge land or resolve debts, or produce labourers. You might be wed at 12 or 13, a girl barely formed given to a man twice her age. There was no ceremony beyond the blessing of the priest and the witness of a few villagers, and the expectation was immediate consummation, no matter how frightened or unwilling you might be. Your body was no longer your own. If you were lucky, your husband was kind. If not, you endured. Divorce was impossible, annulment a distant dream granted only to the wealthy, and abuse had no name because it was not seen as a crime. You birthed children not because you wished to, but because you had to, many of them, because many would die. You prayed not for a son or a daughter, but for one child, just one, to live past the age of 5, and when they did, you worked them young. By 7, they would herd animals, or fetch water, or weed gardens. By 10, they were full labourers, expected to contribute to the household or the fields. Childhood was not a protected time, but a brief prelude to usefulness. Education was a rare privilege. If you were a peasant, you likely never held a book, or even saw one. If you were noble, you might learn to read in Latin or French, but even then, the knowledge was limited to scripture, law, or estate management. Women were seldom taught letters unless destined for a convent. Learning came from repetition, from memorizing the rhythms of the seasons, the signs of sickness, the prayers of the Mass, the stories told by firesides. Oral tradition preserved history and culture more than books did, and storytellers were both treasured and feared. The line between bard and heretic was thin. To speak too well, to know too much, was dangerous. And still, there was war, endless war, between lords, between kingdoms, between faiths. You might be conscripted to fight a war you didn't understand, for a cause you didn't choose. You would march for weeks on foot, sleep in mud, eat stale bread and dried beans, and face enemies who looked just like you, peasant men, given swords and told to kill or be killed. The armor was not glorious. It was heavy, suffocating, rust-prone. If you were struck in battle, no surgeon waited to save you. There were no antibiotics, no sterile blades. A wound was a sentence. You could lose a limb to rot, or your life to fever. If you returned home, it might be with half your face, or missing fingers, or memories that clawed at your sleep, and home might not welcome you. A man who could not work, could not eat. You might end your days begging in a village square, ignored by the people you once protected. And yet, amidst all this, there was still joy, brief, flickering, defiant. On feast days, you might drink ale and sing songs by firelight, your voice joined by others in ancient harmonies passed down for centuries. You might dance in bare feet on wet grass, spinning with girls whose laughter was like bells in the dusk. You might catch the eye of someone kind and feel, for a moment, the warmth of something close to love. You might taste honey or a roasted bird once a year and remember it all year long. You might carve a wooden toy for your child, or wear a flower crown at midsummer, or light a candle in memory of your grandmother. And in these tiny acts of hope, you would find your humanity. But you, the modern visitor, would not know where to look for these moments. You would be too overwhelmed, too broken by the grind of need, the shock of violence, the absence of privacy, comfort, and security. You would long for a bath, for clean sheets, for silence, for choice. You would miss the flick of a switch, the hum of a refrigerator, the glow of a screen. You would ache for medicine, for fairness, for rest, and soon you would stop speaking. The language would become a wall, the customs would confuse you, the danger would silence you. And when you finally lay down on the rough straw of your borrowed bed, exhausted not just in body but in soul, you would understand, not with words but with a deep, unshakable knowledge, that the people of the medieval world did not survive because they were stronger, but because they had no choice. And still the world would turn, the seasons would pass, the wars would continue, the plagues would return, the people would endure, but you would not last a day, not because you are soft, but because the world that made you no longer exists here, and the world that does is one that never waited for strangers. Even as you resigned yourself to the harsh rhythm of this life, you would come to know that every season brought with it not merely change, but a new layer of dread, a fresh test of your endurance, and an ever-present reminder that in this world, survival was the only true triumph. Spring would arrive not with the cheerful symbolism you've been taught to celebrate, but as a sudden muddy awakening, the frozen earth thawing into a sea of sludge, bringing the stench of rot and the reveal of corpses buried shallow or forgotten by the roadside, victims of winter's long starvation, or the pestilences that crept through cold air and took the weak silently in their sleep. With spring came back breaking labor, ploughing the sodden fields with crude wooden tools, guiding reluctant oxen through muck that sucked at your legs like quicksand, sowing seeds with frozen fingers still stiff from winter. The promise of renewal hung always at the edge of collapse. One poor planting meant hunger next winter, one late frost meant wasted seed, and the bite of a sudden storm could rip away your only hope of bread months later. As the season struggled to stabilize, your days were measured by the weather's temperament. Was the ground firm enough to walk without sinking? Did the clouds look like they'd bring hail? Was the river about to flood again, destroying the furrows dug by your aching hands? It was not a romantic season of rebirth, but a frantic rush to sow before nature took what little time she gave. When summer arrived, it did not bring ease. It brought heat that made the stench of unwashed bodies unbearable, that turned your single tunic into a prison of sweat, that lured vermin and disease in droves. You would learn the maddening torment of flies as they swarmed your food, your sores, your eyes. You'd learn to wave them off in your sleep. You would live with the omnipresent hum of insects around your face and under your skin. The work never lessened, it merely changed. You harvested early crops, tended livestock, gathered herbs for medicine you barely trusted, and hunted vermin not for sport but for protection. Your only rest might come at night, if you were lucky enough to collapse in exhaustion before the fleas began to bite or the nightmares arrived. Summer was also the season of war and raiding, when lords settled grudges with steel and fire, and when travelers became threats, not guests. You would learn to fear distant hoofbeats and the sight of unfamiliar banners on the horizon. If soldiers passed through your village, they would not be noble knights in shining armor. They would be dirty, cruel, desperate men who might take your chickens, your harvest, your daughters. They might press you into service, or accuse you of theft, or burn your barn for sport. The soldiers you once imagined as heroes were nothing more than weapons wielded by the ambitions of men you'd never meet. Even your local lord, who feasted in his manor with his retainers and drank wine from silver cups while you chewed stale barley bread, might summon you at a moment's notice to carry water, to dig a ditch, to stand watch with a pitchfork at the edge of the forest because he feared an enemy who had wronged his grandfather a generation ago. And when autumn crept in, it brought with it a cruel accounting. Harvest meant a frenzy of labor, with everyone in the household, old men, children, pregnant women, dragged into the fields to reap grain before the rains came. The days were long, your back screamed, your hands bled, and your stomach growled as you worked from dawn to dusk on food you might not be allowed to keep. A portion went to your lord, a portion to the church, a portion was reserved for seed. What remained was divided as best it could be, sometimes stretched with weeds or sawdust or bone meal just to fill the gaps. And still you prayed the rats wouldn't find your stores, that the thatch roof wouldn't leak, that mildew and rot wouldn't spoil the barley before you could grind it. Each year brought the same fear. What if the winter is worse than the last? You would begin to count days not with hope, but with anxiety. How many meals could you make stretch? How many candles you had left? How many logs in the stack? You would butcher livestock with trembling hands, not because you pitied them, but because you feared you wouldn't see meat again until spring. And you might salt what little meat you could spare, only to find it gone moldy when you finally opened the barrel. Autumn was the moment when reality hit hardest. You had done all you could, and now your life hung in the balance of fate. And then winter, the cruel judge, would return. It began subtly, a chill in the air, frost on your lashes, the silence of birds who had flown south. Then came the snow, the ice, the wind that found every gap in your walls and every weakness in your bones. You'd wrap yourself in every scrap of cloth you owned, and still shiver beside the fire, if you were lucky enough to have wood. You'd eat dried roots and tough bread, and dream of warmth as your toes numbed and your teeth ached from cold. You'd hear coughing in the night, dry, rattling, lingering. You'd hope it was not the same sound your brother made before he died last year, or your mother the year before that. Sickness spread easily in the dark, in the closeness of shared beds and unwashed hands. You would do your best with herbs and hot water, but often the sick died anyway, and you would bury them in frozen ground, digging with tears and frost-bitten fingers. If you were alone, you might not bury them at all, simply covering them with straw and praying the wolves didn't come. Winter took more than just the weak. It took the will of the strong, grinding them down with hunger and cold until they no longer rose in the morning. You would understand why people once feared winter like a beast, a living thing that hunted the poor. Even if you lived through all the seasons, year after year, you would never be safe. Your life remained always subject to powers beyond your control. If you were a serf, your status was fixed. You belonged to the land, and the land belonged to your lord. You could not leave without permission. If you tried, you could be hunted down, dragged back, whipped, branded, or worse. You might be sold with the land if your lord died. You might be traded as part of a debt. Your freedom was not a right, but a dream, a dangerous fantasy whispered only when drunk or dying. And even those rare moments of escape, joining a monastery, becoming a soldier, running to the anonymity of a city, came with new chains. Monks surrendered their identity and labored in silence. Soldiers risked death daily and earned no loyalty, and the cities were cauldrons of disease, crime, and hunger. If you tried to start a new life there, you might end up cleaning latrines for scraps or dying in an alley, unwept and unnoticed. And then there was faith, the only comfort, the only structure, the only answer. And yet even that was a minefield. You had to believe. There was no room for doubt. Heresy was punished not with debate, but with fire. You might ask too many questions, read the wrong text, trust the wrong teacher, and find yourself accused of harboring evil. You would confess, not to God, but to men who saw your soul as something to be policed. The church's grip was absolute, not only on your spirit, but on your daily life. The calendar was filled with saints' days, feast days, days of fasting. You would know when to eat meat, when to abstain, when to kneel, when to give. You would be told what to believe, and if you disagreed, even silently, you risked damnation not only in the afterlife, but in this one too. People would turn against you, report you, whisper that you were unclean. The priest might name you from the pulpit, or worse, ignore you entirely, a spiritual death as profound as any physical one. And yet you needed the church, for the sacraments, for the burial of your dead, for the protection it promised, though it rarely delivered. You would participate because you had no choice, and because in a world so chaotic and cruel, belief was the only way to make sense of anything. And what of joy, what of art and beauty? You would find it, but never easily. It came in flashes, in the sound of a lute played at a feast, in the glow of stained glass, in a cold chapel, in the story told by a traveller who had seen strange lands. It came in the embroidery of a child's cloak, or the pattern carved into a pew, or the way the wheat shimmered in the sun before harvest, but it was always fleeting. You could not dwell on it. There was no time to indulge the way your world allows. No one sat and painted landscapes for pleasure. No one wrote novels to be enjoyed with tea. Poetry existed, but often in service to God or king. Drama, music, sculpture, these were mostly for the rich or the clergy. You would rarely touch beauty. You might only glimpse it and then return to mud, fire, and toil. Even death did not promise peace. Burial was sacred, but only for those who could afford consecrated ground. If you died a stranger, a sinner, or too poor to merit attention, your body might be dumped in a pit or left to decay where it fell. There were no headstones for most. The earth took you without memory. The idea of legacy, of being remembered, honoured, celebrated, was foreign to all but the highest classes. Most people died as they lived, unseen, unnamed, and unmourned beyond their immediate kin, and those left behind had little time to grieve. Life went on. The fields still needed tending, the animals feeding, the children watching. Grief was a luxury no one could afford for long. And perhaps, after all this, you would begin to understand that what made medieval life unbearable was not merely the hunger, the sickness, the violence, the oppression, but the absence of control. You could not choose what to do, where to go, whom to marry, how to live, or even how to die. You were a leaf on the wind of forces older and stronger than yourself. Weather, war, disease, God, Lord, every action you took was governed by necessity or fear. There was no reinvention, no second act, no therapy, or reintegration, or redemption arc. There was only enduring. You would see why people clung to tales of saints and miracles, why they painted hell in such vivid detail, why they dreamed not of life, but of heaven. It was not hope that kept them going, it was habit, momentum, and the knowledge that stopping meant dying. So no, you wouldn't last a day, not because you lack strength, or virtue, or courage, but because the very foundation of your being would be torn away. You live in a world of choices. They lived in a world of consequences, and once you stepped into theirs, you would never be the same again. And still, the illusion of stability that sometimes settled on a calm day when the sky seemed clear and the wind momentarily kind would dissolve with a single spark. Fire, perhaps, the old enemy of every thatch-roofed village and timber-framed town. A dropped lantern, a lightning strike, or a vengeful hand could ignite the heart of a settlement in minutes. Flames licking dry beams with unnatural hunger, racing across roofs, collapsing ceilings onto sleeping children and elderly who moved too slowly to escape. Fire in the medieval world did not wait for firemen, for there were none. There were only buckets hastily filled from wells, chains of villagers shouting orders that no one followed, and the screams of livestock and humans as the inferno consumed homes, barns, grain stores, and lives alike. There were no insurance claims afterward, no temporary shelters waiting, only ash and rubble and grief. And yet the morning after, those who remained would sweep the char, begin to re-thatch, salvage blackened tools, rebuild as if they hadn't lost all hope. The church bell, if the tower still stood, would toll for the dead and summon the living to kneel, not to question why such suffering had come, but to pray that it might pass them next time. And should fire not destroy your life, plague might. The arrival of sickness in a town or village was not a rare event, but a certainty that everyone lived with like a shadow. The word pestilence echoed with a kind of whispered fear, and the signs were unmistakable. First a cough, then fever, then blackened swellings beneath arms and groin, then death, sometimes within a day. The Black Death was only the most infamous. Other outbreaks came often more local, less deadly perhaps, but still devastating. And when it came, people changed. Trust fractured. Families locked their doors against neighbors, fled without farewell, abandoned kin to die alone. Priests blessed bodies from doorways or refused altogether. Entire towns emptied. Cats were killed by the hundreds for supposed devilry, Jews and foreigners were hunted down and blamed. Men wandered half-mad, flagellating themselves in the streets, believing their pain might buy off God's wrath. The healthy were not safe, they were merely waiting, and even if you survived one plague, the fear of the next never left. You would carry the memory of the stink of rotting flesh, the horror of silence where once there was laughter, and the knowledge that death was not orderly or fair or meaningful. It was random, cruel, and always near. And if not fire or plague, then famine. You would learn what it meant when the grain failed, when the rains came too long, or not at all, when locusts blackened the sky, when hail crushed young wheat under ice. You would know hunger not as a fleeting sensation between meals, but as a companion that woke with you and lay beside you at night. Hunger that made your muscles cramp and your vision blur, that made a turnip feel like gold and rat meat worth fighting over. You would watch children wither, their bellies bloated, not from fullness but emptiness, their limbs brittle like twigs. You would hear stories of people boiling leather shoes, of grinding tree bark into powder, of eating grass or worse, and you would not dismiss these as exaggerations. They were not rare, they were remembered because they happened often enough to shape the memory of whole generations. Cannibalism, always whispered in the corners of famine tales, would cease to be unimaginable. In your starvation, you would realize that the limits of humanity can vanish when survival demands it, and that desperation can reshape even the most sacred laws. And yet in all this chaos, one of the cruelest truths would be how easily your body failed you. Without clean water, without sanitation, without rest, your body would betray you day by day. Toothaches would become abscesses that swelled your face until your eyes sealed shut. Cuts would fester into infections that blackened your flesh. Women died in childbirth with horrifying regularity, not from the pain but from the bleeding, the tearing, the fevers that followed. Babies who cried weakly for a few hours and then never again were wrapped in rags and buried with the others. The strongest men could be crippled by a twisted ankle in muddy fields that became infected by dirty water, and there were no doctors as you understand them. There were barbers who cut and bled, midwives with folk wisdom, monks who copied texts and guessed remedies. If you broke a bone, it might be set roughly and heal crooked. If you had a fever, they might bleed you. If you heard voices, you might be called possessed and tied to your bed, or taken to the woods and left to God. No one knew about germs or vitamins or brain chemistry. Healing was a blend of ritual, superstition, and luck. Even rest, the simplest medicine, was a luxury for the few. And as your body weakened, your mind might too, not from madness but from weariness. Chronic stress, though they had no name for it, would press down upon you daily. You would never feel truly safe, never truly clean, never fully warm, and that wears the soul. The endless effort to stay alive, to protect what little you have, to anticipate the next blow, grinds people into versions of themselves they no longer recognize. You might become suspicious, cold, even cruel. A stranger asking for food might look more like a threat than a soul in need. You would learn to lie with conviction, to hide your better nature, because kindness could cost your life. You would envy those who died in sleep, or in battle, or even by accident, because at least they were free. You would look at the sky and wonder if the world beyond the stars was better. You might begin to believe that the reason God allowed suffering was because this life was not the one that mattered, and so you'd start looking forward to the next, not with joy, but with longing. If you were a woman, your burdens multiplied. You would live in a world where your worth was measured in dowry, fertility, obedience. Your body was not your own. If you were married, your husband had rights you could not refuse. If you were raped, it was your reputation that suffered. If you were widowed, you might be cast out, married off again, or worse, accused of witchcraft. The mere fact of being outspoken, independent, knowledgeable in herbs or dreams could doom you. And if you bore children, your life was a cycle of pain and duty, pregnancy, childbirth, nursing. Then again, miscarriages were common, as were stillbirths. The line between life and death was thin and treacherous, and you walked it constantly. Even love was dangerous, for too much of it could distract from your duties, could lead to sin, to scandal, to ruin. Your labor was constant and often invisible. Baking, weaving, sewing, feeding, cleaning, birthing, burying, and still you could be beaten, starved, accused, abandoned. If you were lucky, you might find a man who treated you gently, or sisters who supported you. If you were not,